Well, I just rearranged a few things. There was a table by the fire that I moved.
Before his sudden death, Tyrone Power finally allowed himself a truth he had buried beneath fame. Scandal and 3 marriages, there was only one woman he truly loved. And the world barely noticed when he lost her. To the public, Power was Hollywood royalty, impossibly handsome, endlessly desired, a leading man whose smile defined an era. But behind closed doors, his life was far lonelier than the legend suggested. The roles brought applause. The marriages brought headlines. None of it brought peace. Those closest to him said that near the end, Tyrone grew reflective, almost haunted. He spoke less about movies and more about regrets, about choices made too quickly, about a love that didn't survive the pressure of fame, studio control, and his own fear of being trapped. While the press obsessed over his glamorous wives, Power's heart kept returning to the same name, the same memory, the same what if. It wasn't the woman fans expected. It wasn't the one photographed on red carpets. And it wasn't the marriage Hollywood tried hardest to sell. As his health declined and his defenses fell, Tyrone reportedly admitted what he'd never dared to say publicly, that the love of his life wasn't the one who shared his last name, but the one he let slip away when he was too young, too controlled, and too afraid to choose happiness over image. What he confessed before death redefined everything we thought we knew about him. Because behind the icon was a man who realized too late that fame fades, beauty disappears, and only one love ever truly mattered. And her name still echoes through his final days, long before his heart gave out on a Spanish film set. Tyrone Power had already begun confronting the one truth he could never outrun. To the world, he remained the flawless matinee idol, confident, charming, immortal. But in private, the man behind the legend was unraveling. Fame had given him everything, except the one thing he could never recreate: the love he let go when he was too young, too controlled, and too afraid to choose it. Those closest to Power noticed the change in his final years. He spoke less like a star and more like a man taking inventory of his life. The conversations drifted away from box office numbers and toward memory. Regret surfaced quietly, not in dramatic confessions, but in the way he lingered on certain names, certain moments. He had been married 3 times, yet none of those relationships were where his voice softened. Instead, it was when he spoke of the woman he never married, the one who had loved him before Hollywood fully owned him. In the early days of his stardom, Tyrone Power lived under intense studio control. Every romance was monitored, approved, or discouraged based on image. He learned quickly that love was a liability, something that could complicate contracts and weaken the illusion audiences adored. When he fell deeply, truly in love, it frightened him. Not because the feeling was wrong, but because it demanded a choice he didn't yet know how to make. Choosing her would have meant choosing himself over the machine that made him famous. So he didn't. The separation wasn't explosive. It was quiet, almost polite. A promise to reconnect someday. A belief that time would wait. But time never does. As his fame grew, the distance became permanent, and by the time he realized what he'd lost, it was already sealed in the past. He married other women, hoping stability would grow where passion hadn't survived. Instead, each marriage left him more restless, more aware that he was playing a role even in his own life. Friends later recalled that Power rarely criticized his wives, but he also never spoke of them as the great love of his life. There was affection, respect, even gratitude, but not the ache, not the unmistakable pull that had never quite disappeared. That belonged to someone else, the woman he loved before the world told him who he had to be. As he aged, the weight of that loss intensified. The roles grew heavier. His body showed signs of strain, and emotionally he became more transparent, less guarded. He admitted that success had come at a cost he hadn't understood at the time. He had confused momentum with happiness, applause with fulfillment. In moments of honesty, he acknowledged that the one person who had known him before the image, the real him, was the one he should never have walked away from. By the time of his final film in Spain, Tyrone Power was already exhausted. Not just physically, but spiritually. Those around him sensed a man closing even if he didn't say it outright. When he reportedly spoke of love near the end, there was no bitterness, only acceptance. He didn't blame Hollywood. He didn't blame fate. He blamed fear. Fear of losing everything, which ironically led him to lose the one thing that mattered most. His sudden death at just 44 shocked the world. But to those who knew him intimately, it felt like a tragic punctuation mark on a life lived in conflict. The confession he made before death, whether spoken directly or understood through his reflections, changed how they saw him. Tyrone Power wasn't a man who lacked love. He was a man who had loved once deeply and spent the rest of his life measuring everything against it. History remembers him as a legend. But in his final truth, he was simply a man who realized too late that fame fades faster than regret. And the woman he never stopped loving? She remained the one role he could never replay, only remember. After the confession, quiet, unrecorded, and never meant for headlines, Tyrone Power's life didn't suddenly change. That was the cruel part. Realizing the truth didn't give him a second chance. It only clarified what had already been lost. The woman he admitted was the love of his life was no longer part of his present. She belonged to a time before the contracts, before the pressure, before he learned how expensive fame could be. And once that realization settled in, it never left him. Those around him noticed that Tyrone became more inward, more selective with his energy. He laughed less easily, listened more closely. When asked about love, he no longer spoke in grand romantic terms. Instead, he talked about timing, how the right person can appear at the wrong moment, and how fear can disguise itself as responsibility. It was clear he wasn't speaking hypothetically. He was speaking from experience, from a wound that had never healed properly. His marriages, once framed by the press as fairy tales, now felt to him like written by someone else. He fulfilled his role as a husband, sometimes sincerely, sometimes mechanically, but always with a sense of distance. The passion he once knew had set an impossible standard. Every relationship after felt like an attempt to recreate something that only existed when his life was still his own. What haunted him most wasn't that he'd lost her, but that he'd known, even then, that she was different. He had felt it in the way silence felt comfortable with her, in how he didn't need to perform. With her, he wasn't Tyrone Power, the icon. He was just a man. That simplicity, ironically, terrified him more than fame ever did. Fame was predictable. Love, what a UASN, single quotes T-dot. As the years passed, he became increasingly aware of how often he had chosen safety over truth. Studio expectations over personal instinct. Appearances over authenticity. Each choice made sense at the time. Together, they formed a life that looked perfect from the outside and felt incomplete from within. When he spoke of regret, it wasn't dramatic. It was matter of fact. As if he'd finally stopped arguing with himself. In his final period, while working abroad, those close to him sensed a man reaching emotional closure. He wasn't chasing new beginnings. He was quietly revisiting old ones. He asked questions about people from his past. He reminisced without nostalgia, without bitterness. And when her name surfaced, carefully, respectfully, there was a pause that said more than words ever could. That pause was the confession. He didn't try to rewrite history. He didn't claim she would have saved him or changed everything. He simply acknowledged the truth. Loving her had been the most real thing he ever experienced. And walking away from that love had been the most defining mistake of his life. Not because it ruined him, but because it followed him everywhere. When Tyrone Power died suddenly, the world mourned a star. Newspapers spoke of lost potential, unfinished films, a life cut short. What they didn't see was that his most important story had already ended years earlier when he let the love of his life slip into memory. His death didn't create the tragedy. It only sealed it. In the years that followed, those who truly knew him remembered that final admission not as sorrowful, but clarifying. It stripped away the myth and left behind something painfully human. Tyrone Power wasn't a man who failed at love repeatedly. He was a man who succeeded once and never found it again. That is what made the confession so powerful. Not scandal, not drama, but recognition. The understanding that some loves don't come back around. They don't wait for better timing. They exist once, fully, and then live forever in comparison. Fame gave Tyrone Power immortality on screen, but love, real love, gave him truth. And in the end, it was that truth, not the applause, that stayed with him until his final breath. In the final weeks of Tyrone Power's life, there was a stillness about him that those closest could not ignore. It wasn't sadness in the dramatic sense, nor was it fear of death. It was acceptance, the kind that arrives only after a person has stopped running from their own past. The confession he had made about the love of his life no longer weighed on him like a secret. It had become a truth he carried quietly, without resistance. Power no longer spoke about the future in grand terms. There were projects, yes, and ideas he entertained out of habit, but his attention was anchored elsewhere. He reflected on the man he had been before fame reshaped his choices. Before schedules replaced instinct. Before love became something to manage rather than feel. In those moments, it was clear that the woman he had lost represented more than romance. She represented the last time. His life had been entirely his own. What made that love so enduring was not drama or obsession, but its simplicity. With her, there had been no audience, no expectations, no performance. He didn't need to impress or protect an image. That freedom, once taken for granted, became irreplaceable. Every relationship that followed was compared, often unconsciously, to that feeling of being fully seen and accepted without conditions. As his health declined, Tyrone Power grew gentler with himself. The anger he once felt toward his own decisions softened into understanding. He realized that he hadn't walked away from love because he lacked courage, but because he lacked perspective. Youth had convinced him that there would always be another chance, another version of the same happiness waiting around the corner. Life, he learned too late, doesn't repeat its purest moments. Those near him noticed how often he returned to memory, not to relive it, but to make peace with it. He didn't fantasize about what might have been. He acknowledged what was. That love had been real, that it had shaped him, that it had taught him what nothing else ever did, and that losing it had quietly defined every choice afterward, whether he admitted it or not. When the end came suddenly, there was no dramatic farewell. No final speech. Just a life interrupted mid-sentence. Yet the people who had heard his reflections understood something the public never would. Tyrone Power did not die confused about who he was or what had mattered most. He had already named it. Already accepted it. Already let go of the illusion that fame could compensate for the one thing he had lost. After his death, stories about him multiplied, some true, some embellished. But among those who knew him best, one truth remained untouched. For all his beauty, success, and legend, Tyrone Power's deepest fulfillment had come not from the roles he played, but from the one relationship that asked nothing of him, except honesty. The woman he called the love of his life was never turned into a myth. She wasn't elevated or dramatized. She remained real, grounded, human, and that was precisely why she mattered more than anything else. She loved the man, not the icon. And he, in the end, understood how rare that kind of love truly is. Tyrone Power's story is often told as a tragedy of early death. But the quieter tragedy, and perhaps the more meaningful one, was that he lived long enough to recognize what he had lost, but not long enough to recover it. That awareness didn't destroy him. It clarified him. In his final understanding, he wasn't a victim of fame or fate. He was a man who made choices, lived with them, and learned from them just like anyone else. The difference was that his lesson arrived too late to change the outcome, but not too late to change the meaning. That is the legacy hidden beneath the legend. In the quiet aftermath of his final days, Tyrone Power's legacy became more than a series of box office hits and Hollywood magazine covers. Those who truly knew him understood that the core of his story, the part he rarely revealed, was the love he had never stopped carrying. Fame had offered him wealth, admiration, and a type of immortality. But it had never given him the one thing he most wanted, the woman who had touched his heart before the cameras ever rolled. In those last weeks, friends recalled that Tyrone spoke less of his accomplishments and more of the people who had shaped his life. His tone was reflective, almost solemn, when he mentioned her name. He didn't frame it as longing or regret, but as recognition. Recognition that her love had been formative, definitive, and ultimately irreplaceable. While the world remembered him as a star who burned brightly, he remembered himself as a man who had loved once completely and never been the same again. Power's final reflections revealed a profound understanding of life's fragility. He acknowledged that choices, no matter how carefully considered, carry consequences that last far longer than anticipated. He admitted that letting her go had been necessary at the time, driven by youth, fear, and the demands of a controlling industry, but that it left a void no other experience could fill. He never blamed anyone, not himself entirely, not the world around him. He simply accepted that some loves, however brief or constrained, shape a person forever. Those who listened felt the quiet gravity of his confession. Tyrone Power, the man whose smile once defined an era, had realized that true happiness isn't measured by applause or accolades. It's measured by authenticity, by being seen fully and without pretense. The woman he called the love of his life had offered him that. Fame never could. Wealth never could. Even his marriages, though loving in their own ways, could not replicate the depth of that first and only perfect connection. As his body weakened, that recognition seemed to free him. He was no longer striving to reclaim lost time or recapture fleeting youth. Instead, he allowed himself to reflect on what mattered most, unburdened by expectation. The confession about his one true love was not dramatic or performative. It was quiet, unspoken to the public, yet monumental in its emotional weight. In it, he acknowledged a truth that had shaped every choice, every triumph, every failure of his life. After his sudden death, the world mourned the star they had adored, immortalized in films and photographs. Yet those who understood the man behind the legend remembered a different story, a story of love unforgotten, of a heart that had carried a single, defining connection across decades. Despite the distractions and demands of fame, they remembered that Tyrone Power, for all his dazzling appearances and heroic roles, had been most alive when he had loved, and when he finally admitted it. In the end, that admission became his quiet legacy. It wasn't a story of scandal or tragedy, but of profound human truth. Power's life reminds us that what we carry internally, our loves, regrets, and moments of clarity, can outweigh the spectacle of what the world sees. The love he confessed to before his death did not make headlines at the time, but it defined him more than any award ever could. Tyrone Power's life may have ended abruptly, but the truth he spoke endured. Real love, once felt and recognized, leaves a mark that fame, fortune, or time can never erase. And though he could not reclaim that lost connection, the acknowledgement of its existence gave his final days meaning in a way that no other achievement ever could. Ultimately, Tyrone Power was remembered not just as a Hollywood icon, but as a man who learned finally and fully what truly mattered and had the courage to admit it before it was too late.